Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we are in game 11 of the 2021 World Chess Championships being held in Dubai between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepo. Now, Magnus Carlsen has 6.5 points coming into today, meaning he's only 1 point away, or one victory away, or 2 draws from being the world champion yet again. His opponent, Jan Nepo, 3.5 points, has some catching up to do, needs essentially a miracle, needs to win 3 of the next 4 games just to tie and take it to tiebreakers. But it all starts here for Jan Nepo. He has the white pieces, has to make something happen. He starts out with e4. Magnus Carlsen responds e5, Nf3 Nc6, bishop to c4. The Italian game. Love the Italian game. Curious to see what variation they choose. Knight to f6 and then d3, bishop to c5. Now, this is the Gioco Piano, but the d3 variation is considered a very quiet game. It's very drawish. It's really a slow game, which not something you would expect to see when white really has to be going for a win. But that's exactly what we see. Pawn to c3, pawn d6 for Magnus Carlsen, castle on the king side, a5, so Magnus Carlsen pushing on the queen side here. Rook to e1, getting this rook involved to the center of the board here. Bishop swings back to a7, still maintaining the pressure on this long dark square diagonal. You can see the pawn here on f2, definitely a weakness. Even after the castle, the king is the only piece defending that pawn. Knight to a3, and then after pawn to h6, just keeping at bay some of the white pieces. The knight typically would come to g5, as well as the bishop coming here to g5. Stops both of those. One of the biggest threats you have in the Italian game, which who knows if we would actually see it, is the move knight to g5 with the knight and the bishop both attacking this pawn on f7. Since both of these pawns have already moved from Magnus Carlsen, e5 and d6, would definitely have to move an additional piece to stop the threat here on f7. You usually don't want to be moving your pawns multiple times, but would definitely need to do that to stop the threat here on f7. But we don't see that. h6 stops that threat here. And then knight to c2. Could have just played knight b5. That's completely fine as well. Attacking the bishop, bishop to b6 is going to be fine as well. But instead, Jan Nepo decides to go ahead and play knight to c2. Have to maneuver it around from the beginning. Could not play just knight to c3 since his pawn is here. So playing the a3 and now c2. Going to swing over here to e3 at some point. Magnus Carlsen castle on the king side, bishop to e3. Says, hey, do you want to exchange? Magnus Carlsen says, absolutely. Knight takes here on e3, and then rook to e8. So Magnus Carlsen doing the same thing, getting his rooks towards the center of the board to just help control the center. This pawn here on e5 definitely wants to maintain that pressure he has. Pawn to a4, so just counterattacking on the queen side is Jan Nepo. Bishop to e6 says, hey, do you want to just trade off bishops? Yeah, completely fine. And that's typically what you'll see in these type of games where it's not open, none of the pawns have come off the board. And these type of games, the knights are actually going to fare better. So they just decide, hey, let's go ahead and get the bishops off the board. We're not going to be using those as much. And now we have the knights. Last piece for white to get involved into the game is the queen. So queen to b3, attacking the pawn here on b7. Then we have b6, rook to d1, and then knight to e7. If you start to look at the moves Magnus Carlsen has here as far as developing this material, he doesn't really have a ton of great options. He could play rook comes back here to e8. Okay, that's completely fine. He could play queen d7, but many times if you don't have a great move, you got to be thinking about what your opponent going to be trying to do. This knight on c6, it doesn't have a lot of great squares. It has an outpost here on d4, but that's defended by this pawn here on c3. And even if it comes to e7, you say, well, you can't really come down to f5 and d5 because both of those are being attacked by the pawn. That is true, but once the knight comes back here to e7, it allows Magnus Carlsen to stop some of the threats that white has, and that's coming to d5 or f5, which are great outposts for white. So he's playing more defensive right now with the knight to e7 because he doesn't have any other strong moves as far as development. Somewhat playing defensive. Again, Magnus Carlsen, man, he's smart. He knows how to win these championships, and he recognizes I just have to get 2 more draws, and I am going to be the champion. So, hey, let's just play it safe here. Knight e7 does that. Pawn to h3. says, yeah, if your knight comes down here to g4, stop some of that threat. Don't really see that happening right now. The bishop, the light square bishop can't come. And also the knight here on e3 was already protecting that. But h3 also opens up if the king ever needs to come to h2. You definitely don't want to have all your pawns just blocking your king. You don't have to worry about any back rank mate or anything like that after you play h3. Queen to d7. And then knight comes back here to h2. Another thing that the pawn on h3 does, allows the knight to maneuver a little bit. So rook to d8, just bringing it to the center of the board here. And then knight to g4. Magnus Carlsen says, yeah, if you want to exchange off material, that's completely fine with me. So they do see the exchange here. And then the pawn takes on g4. One of the ideas here is we need to swing the rook over to h1 at some point. Hopefully they get behind enemy lines. Nepo just trying to find any sort of initiative that he can possibly have here. Pawn to d5, Magnus Carlsen says, yeah, let's go ahead and blow up the center of the board. I don't want you to be working your way towards the king side of the board, so let's keep things towards the center here. Pawn to d4, we do see the exchange on the d file. And then rook down to e4, attacking this pawn right here, also defending the pawn on d4. And the rook coming to e4, probably more advisable than knight taking here on d5. Things get pretty complicated after rook takes on d4. You can see a lot of the pressure on this knight here with the pawn pushing forward to c4. Then the knight's being pinned down. Not great. Knight can't move right now. The queen falls. So maybe pawn to c5, attacking this rook. But then after the rook comes back here, how does black really respond? Maybe pawn to c4, stopping the pawn from pushing forward, but then the queen just takes. You're losing material here. You still have this knight being pinned down. You have now the knight, the rook, and the queen attacking it. So Magnus Carlsen correctly plays rook to e4 instead of taking that pawn. Magnus Carlsen just hasn't really made too many errors in this entire tournament. Queen to c2. Then we see rook to f4, since it's being attacked by the queen here. And then we see a huge blunder from white. Unfortunately, Nepo does it again. He really needed to, in this position, play something like rook takes here on d4. And then there is going to be a flurry of exchanges, and that's not exactly what he wants. You don't want to go into the endgame with no advantage at all, because it's very difficult to figure any sort of initiative against Magnus Carlsen, especially since you already have the double pawns here on the g file. Because from here, the pawn takes, knight takes, you can start to see even more exchanges. Potentially the queen takes on c7. You just are exchanging material, and there's no end in sight for you to win. But unfortunately, he plays the move g3 and just does not really think about all of the threats in the game. Because yes, this pawn is attacking the rook, but the pawn taking here on e3, this is a deadly move from Magnus Carlsen. Pawn takes the rook. Yes, material advantage for white in that exchange. But after the queen takes on g4, the threats are very difficult for white to deal with. The king comes back to f1, queen to h3 check, king to g1. Magnus Carlsen has some couple options here. If you watch the stream or you kind of run your own analysis here, it says that the best move is pawn takes here on f2. And then the queen takes here, and then rook to d6, with the thought of the rook swinging over here to g6. That's kind of the idea. I don't think it's quite this easy, though, for Magnus Carlsen. We're at move 26 right now. He didn't have as much time as I think he would have liked. And there's some complications going on. You don't know exactly, how things would look, after rook to d6. You have to start thinking about, okay, pawn to f5. Does that stop it? Okay, well, the rook can't swing over here right now. How would I continue? Maybe queen to f1, just attacking the queen. Remember, in the exchange, white did better, got the rook, just gave up a knight, and so has to make sure he still always has the advantage. You could always look at queen to g2. I think Magnus Carlsen was just analyzing all those positions, said, I'm not 100% confident that this is so much better than just playing the safer route, and that is the move knight to f5, which I really like from Magnus Carlsen. I think it's intuitive, and I think it still maintains a lot of the pressure. If the pawn takes here, he always has the threat of the knight coming down, either taking this material, coming here to g3 with many threats as well. And so I feel like just getting more material involved into the game, I feel like is the safer approach. So from here, we see d6. White recognizes that one of the main threats is the rook to d6, swing over to g6, and so he stops that right away with pawn to d6. Knight to h4 with the threat of queen to g2 checkmate, so definitely have to stop that. First stops it with pawn takes here on e3 so that the queen can now protect that square here on g2. Now Magnus Carlsen plays queen g3 check. Obviously not going to see queen to g2 stopping that because that's just going to be a mate right there. Instead, we see king to f1. And then knight to f3, followed by queen to f2. And the threat's just too much. So, yes, you could take the pawn here on a c7, attacking the rook here on d8, but just catastrophic. It's going to be over after queen to g1 check, and then queen to g2 checkmate. So, really has to stop it with the queen. Plays queen to f2, queen to h3 check, queen to g2, and now decides to go ahead and exchange here. Anytime Magnus Carlsen is trading off his queen, things are definitely going to go poorly for you, especially with the exposed king here. So after the king takes, knight takes here on e1, rook takes, and then rook takes on d6. So Magnus Carlsen says, I'm going to play it safe. Getting into the endgame, I'm up a pawn in material. I can execute this all day long. And he's probably calculated to the T exactly how to do that. In the endgame, he's just not going to lose, and he just has such a huge advantage here. He feels pretty confident that he can win this 100 times out of 100, so why take any risk? King to f3, trying to get that king involved into the game. Rook down to d2. Anytime you have a rook in the end game, you want to get it to your opponent's second rank if you're black, or white if you want to get up to the seventh rank, usually because you can get behind enemy lines. Usually all the pawns have not moved yet, so you can start to chip away and start to gain some material on your opponent. Rook to b1, just playing defense, not exactly where you want to be if you're Jan Nepo. Pawn to g6, pawn up here to b4. We do see the exchange right here, but then rook over here to a2, threatening this pawn. Again, just playing defense here. King to e4, pawn h5. Magnus Carlsen has these passed pawns on the king side, and it is going to be very difficult to deal with. King to d5, and this is, another mistake from Jan Nepo. Just not exactly what he needs to do here, because rook to c2, and this just makes it very, very clear that white's not going to be able to come over here and defend this pawn from pushing forward here to h1. Rook now has to support, and the rook here on b3, pawn to h4, king up to c6. Says, I need to gobble up some of this material, but doesn't matter. Pawn to h3, king takes, pawn down to h2, just pushing those pawns as much as possible. And then rook to b1, gobbles up this material here on c3. And then after the king takes on b6, probably my favorite move and a fitting way to end the world championship, Magnus Carlsen plays the move rook to b3, sacrificing this rook here on b3. It's check, so you pretty much have to take. Jan Nepo, being a good sport about it, takes it and still plays on a little bit longer. Pawn to h1, getting that queen, pawn to a5, and then playing queen to e4. I like this move again from Magnus Carlsen, allowing his opponent to make more mistakes. I feel like every single move he does is just allowing his opponent to hang himself, because you could see a6 here. That would lose to queen to e6 check, and then after the king moves, the rook is going to fall. Jan Nepo not going to do that. Instead, plays king to a7, queen to e7 check, king to a8, and then king to g7. Not many moves longer. Rook to b6, and then Magnus Carlsen plays queen to c5. And you can see the thread here. Really, this is attacking both the pawn here on a5 as well as the rook. Not too worried about the rook here. He's not going to exchange the queen for the rook, but where does the rook really move from here? He wants to play something like rook to a6 potentially to just stop the queen from taking here. Okay, but then your pawn is stopped here, and so Magnus Carlsen can just start pushing on this king side of the board. The rook can't go anywhere else, though. Can't come to c6 or d6 because it would just get gobbled up by the queen. Can't come to e6 here. And so all of a sudden, his options are to move the rook or just lose this pawn if he wants to come anywhere else. That's not where you want to be. And he realizes this game is over. So he resigns. Magnus Carlsen gets the victory with the black pieces, and the best of 14 series is over. Magnus Carlsen retains his title, 7.5 points to 3.5 points. An absolute dominant performance from Magnus Carlsen. I feel pretty bad for Jan Nepo because on a good day, I think he is just as good as Magnus Carlsen. On his best day, he has shown that he's actually better. But Magnus Carlsen, there's no denying how good this guy is. And in a World Championship Series, he's just the best. And if we go back to Game 6, the longest game ever in a World Championship Series, Magnus Carlsen just drained his opponent, I think. And after that, Jan Nepo realized, man, I don't think I can play at this high level. And that almost just destroyed internally everything that Jan Nepo had. So after that, it was kind of downhill, continued to make mistakes. Magnus Carlsen capitalized, and he is victorious. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the series. It's been a fun couple weeks covering this. Some really fun play. Magnus Carlsen, well-deserving champion. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. I appreciate the support of the channel. If you wouldn't mind hitting that like button, definitely helps the channel out a lot. And let me know in the comments what you thought of this series. I know hopefully many of you have watched multiple videos that we've put out. So just curious, feedback for me, for the channel, of the coverage, anything that can help improve for future videos, that would definitely be appreciated. So thank you guys so much for watching and the support, and I'll see you guys next time.